Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. So, you may be aware there's a lot of turmoil here at home with our ailing president and whether he will stay on the ticket. We may talk about a little about that when we get a chance, but we really wanted to do something about what was going on in Europe and the UK, which are different places, as our guest will be quick to remind me if I ever fail to make that point. We had a major historic election in the UK. We had a really interesting election that just concluded basically yesterday in France, and we have strange things going on at home. And so I figured I would get one of my favorite people who knows more about more things than most people know about anything, and a notorious Whig in the greatest sense of the term. And he's a conservative member of the House of Lords and a columnist, none other than my friend Daniel Hannan. Daniel, thanks for coming back on.
Thank you, Jonah. Thank you. And I'll take Notorious Whig. Not Notorious Whig, as you can see, I could do with one of those, but this is what 20 years in the European Parliament does to you.
So why don't we start close to home for you? What is your major takeaway from the parliamentary elections? Was this a conservative failure, a Labour victory? Is that a binary thing that one goes with the other? How worried are you about reform, which is the Nigel Farage, sort of in shorthand for American listeners, Trumpy-ish party? What is your grand take on all of it?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it used to be the case that we had like a pendulum, or like those people who used to come in and out on a cuckoo clock, right? So when one was doing well, the other one wasn't. Not so much now. We have an electoral system and a parliament designed for two parties, plus maybe one also ran. And we've now got four parties comfortably in double figures and a couple of others. So that the system is throwing up some really anomalous results. And we've probably got the least proportionate result by some measure that we've ever had in terms of the relationship between the number of votes the party got versus the number of seats it won. So a few historical breakthroughs here, a few records. First of all, this is the worst ever Conservative result. I think our party, my party, is the oldest continuous party in discovered space, right? We were founded in 1834 by Sir Robert Peel. We've never done as badly as this. I mean, this is off the scale in a general election for us. Does that mean that Labour's done particularly well? Actually, no. Another record. A winning party has never won with a lower proportion of the vote than Labour just got. So Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, got fewer votes than Boris Johnson got last time, than Jeremy Corbyn got last time. He got fewer votes than either the winner or the loser got last time, right? This is a very, very low turnout. So what's happened? Basically, first of all, a lot of people stayed at home, not a lot of enthusiasm. But second, and this is the real problem, that the right is split, which is calamitous under a first-past-the-post voting system. So what you call the Trumpy party, the Reform Party run by Nigel Farage, who was my colleague in the European Parliament for 21 years, they only took 5 seats, but they probably cost us about 100 seats. I'm not assuming that everyone who voted Reform would have otherwise voted Conservative, but I am assuming that most of them would, right? And I think on any fair measure, we were two right-of-centre parties. So the result of this is that Labour has this unbelievable lead, right? 411 Labour MPs, 121 Conservative MPs, 5 Reform MPs. But really, not based on any enthusiasm, not based on any surge of votes for them. On the contrary, other than in Scotland, where there was a big swing away from the Scottish National Party, the Labour Party didn't really get any more votes at all. So what we're seeing is a collapse on the right, not a surge of enthusiasm for the left.
Yeah, I heard from a couple friends and I read a couple places comparing it to Tony Blair's win in '97, where there it was a lot like Obama's, where like just people in the street were cheering. It was considered like this major event, and there's none of that mood in the UK for this. This is it's not to say that hardcore partisan, Labour party people aren't enthusiastic and excited and all that, but it does not feel or look like it's a societal break towards labor the way you would think just going by the top line numbers.
Yeah, I think that's a really good parallel. When Obama won, or indeed when Blair won, there was such a mood of enthusiasm, like some kind of, foreign occupation had been ended, that it was actually quite infectious, even for those of us who voted the other way. You couldn't completely remain not caught up in it, right? You're absolutely spot on, Jonah. There is none of that this time, and things are only going to get worse. Now, look, I mean, for heaven's sake, don't mistake what I'm saying for any kind of complacency, right? Even if every Reform voter had voted Conservative, there would have still been a Labour majority, a much smaller one, but they would have still won. But I think a lot of the Tory unpopularity had to do mainly with things that had their origins in the lockdown that voters have now forgotten about or chosen to cram into some distant corner of their mind. So people are complaining about, why are hospital waiting lists up? Why are we taxing more? Why hasn't everyone come back to work? How come we've got all these price rises? And of course, the answer to all of those things is lockdown, i.e. a policy that 93% of you, the electorate, demanded. But human nature being what it is, it's much more tempting to shuffle off the blame. And by the way, I think this is a global phenomenon, right? So there were a couple of leaders internationally who were sly enough to catch the moment during the pandemic when they were still giving, statesman-like TV briefings every night. So Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Justin Trudeau in Canada, they went during the crisis and were re-elected. Almost everyone who has been in after the pandemic, when the bills have come in, has been hammered. Because we've been in for 14 years, we got a commensurately bigger hammering, because every kind of annoyance and irritation that people have is attached to us. This is the thing, you knew you were inviting a kind of geeky historian on, right? So as well as it being the worst result since the Tory party was founded in 1834, when has any party ever won 5 elections in a row, which is what we would have been doing this time? The answer is it has not happened in the age of democracy. It last happened, the last time that a party was elected for a 5th time in a row was in 1830, when parties were really much more nebulous than they are now. And even then, they were absolutely pulverized the next time, right? So it is quite a difficult thing. It's a big ask to be re-elected for a 5th time, even in normal times, right? Even if we didn't have the inflation, the tax rises, and all the other things that came out of the pandemic, but that people have now got amnesia about.
Yeah, so I've been trying to make this point in the context of American politics, and I don't want to talk about American politics yet, but it seems to me that there are a lot of people who have their partisan blinders on, and they look for the evidence that that the far right or right wing populism is on the march, or that the left is on the march, or whatever. And it turns out, it seems to me, with obviously large sample sizes, you're going to have a lot of noise in the data. But it feels to me that the West, in part because of the COVID stuff you were describing, is in an anti-incumbent mood. So incumbents who are who've been around for a while, they're taken in the neck. And so and the reason why I think that's relevant for America is that I honestly think if they got rid of Joe Biden and which makes it complicated, also Kamala Harris, and went with a Midwestern Democratic governor who does not have his fingerprints on any, or her fingerprints on any of the stuff that people are pissed off and exhausted by, that candidate could actually win fairly handily. But in Europe, the far right seemed poised on the second round to have a great night. Instead, Macron organized this big sort of popular front thing with the far left, which I think is going to turn out to be a disaster. And in the UK, people want to say, see, this is the triumph of the center left, but it turns out, no, it's just people are exhausted with the status quo. And if you are associated with the status quo, you're in real trouble in almost every Western democracy, as far as I can tell.
100%. And what we're also seeing is what psychologists call hindsight bias. A lot of people have backdated their present opinions and now think that they were against the lockdowns at the time and direct their rage at the politicians who were doing what they were demanding. They, the voters, were demanding at the time. I mean, we have the opinion poll data, and it's there pitilessly in numbers in this country. And I don't think we were that much outliers. 93% of voters backed the first lockdown, 85% backed the second lockdown, and 71%, incredibly, didn't want restrictions lifted when they were lifted in the summer of 2021. Now, the irony here is that two of the most strongly anti-lockdown politicians in the country were Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. Everything that we've now seen of all these kind of leaks about what was happening in 2020, Boris is the only guy in the room saying, hang on, we're overdoing this. Haven't we overreacted? And all the medical establishment are saying, no, you mustn't, it's going to be far worse than you say and all this. And actually, he's been completely vindicated when you look at the final sort of, when you compare death tolls in countries with different lockdowns. But nobody wants to hear that. And it's very similar to what happened over the Iraq invasion. There was a polling company here that it asked people, on the eve of the invasion, do you support it? And it was like 68% or something backed the invasion. It then went back and used exactly the same method and asked people who had been old enough to reply, did you support the Iraq war? And it had fallen to like 38% or something. People do this. It's a very natural human trait. We find it difficult to imagine that we ever held different opinions from our present opinions. And I'm afraid that has hit every incumbent. With your permission, I'd like to talk a little bit about the rise of populism as well, because I think, or whatever, I mean, populism is a bad word because populism so often means something that other people like, but that I don't like, right? So, let's say the rise of these insurgent parties that define politics as real people versus somehow unreal people, that nurture a sense of grievance, that elevate the leader over the party, that say that everyone else is corrupt. Why is that happening? And it is a widespread phenomenon. It's happened in the US, it's happened in Europe, and it's now beginning to happen in the UK. And it's been happening for the better part of 10 or 15 years. So I have three candidates here. One is global financial crisis. People saw wealthy bankers and bondholders bailed out to rescue them from their own mistakes, and low and medium income voters taxed to do it. The second possibility is, let's call it the Jonathan Haidt scenario. We've all just been made dumber and more irritable by smartphones. We are more prone to conspiracy theories. We are our attention spans have shrunk. You can measure this in a gazillion different ways, and we just don't want the complexities and trade-offs that are intrinsic in politics. The third option is mass migration, which is unsettling electorates the world over, because as living standards rise and as technology improves in poorer countries, it's much more feasible for a lot more people to attempt these journeys than it used to be. So, we can argue about which of those it is. Maybe something completely different. Those are my three candidates. The reason I'm interested in those as candidates is I sometimes think an interesting way of looking at these trends internationally is to ask yourself, are there any countries that have not done this? Are there any countries that have held out against the trend? And can we extrapolate anything from their experience? And look, I think here the countries, the wealthy Western countries that have outstandingly remained free from this populist trend, the countries where you still have parties recognizably like they were in the late 90s, a free market, small government centre-right party versus a sort of mainstream centre-left party, are Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, what have they all got in common? I would say two things. One, they all came through the financial crisis without a complete collapse. And two, because of geography, they don't have the problem of illegal immigration. Actually, all three of them sustain very high levels of legal migration, legal inward migration, with a remarkable degree of political consensus. It could be those things. which would suggest that it isn't the Jonathan Haidt smartphone dumb phone theory, or it could be something else entirely. But whatever it is, I think it has now caught the UK, and we saw the first stirrings of it on Thursday of last week.
Yeah, I mean, long-time listeners of this podcast know I loathe monocausal explanations for any serious phenomenon, right? So it could be all three. The just as an aside, the thing that always pops into my head when this kind of thing comes up is, remember John Keegan, the military historian? We interviewed him for a PBS show that I used to produce, and he had this wonderful little explanation about why certain Plains Indians were the single deadliest warriors in all of human history. And he said it was a combination of the culture that they were raised in to be able to live off the land, the introduction of the horse, and the introduction of the Remington rifle. And you put those three things together and you get something completely new in history. And I think similarly, I mean, it's sort of on the Remnant bingo card. I bring it up all the time, but Orwell has that line where he says one can feel himself a failure and take to drink and become all the more of a failure because he drinks. The smartphone stuff, in conjunction with illegal immigration, in conjunction with financial crisis, and probably a dozen other things put all together, create this kind of environment that is predictive for some people, but less so for other people, or more powerful in some nations versus other nations. I do want to ask you a question about, so you're one of these conservatives in the American political argot, classical liberal. That's why I called you a Whig earlier. And I would say you come to your principles first, and therefore you say, okay, this is the party for me. And there are other people who say this is the party for me, and therefore these are going to be my principles depending on where the party goes. And that's what we've seen a lot of with Trump. Right now we're seeing a lot of that with Biden. But one of the things that I think that gets lost among conservatives in America is that the point of the conservative movement was not to make the Republican Party more conservative. The point of the conservative movement was to move the center of gravity of America in a more conservative direction. And the problem is that I think a lot of people, including some of my closest friends who I respect dearly, they've so internalized the idea that what is good for Republicans is good for conservatism, and what is good for conservatism is good for Republicans, that sometimes they cannot see progress that has a different partisan valence to it. And so I would argue that you can make a case that the election of Keir Starmer, for all the problems that will come with it, for all the problems of having labor in charge, and there will be many, is at least in some respects a victory for conservatism, because Starmer famously moved his party away from Corbynism, away from the sort of jackassery of the hard left 15 years ago, and realized, sort of like Bill Clinton, whatever is in Starmer's actual heart, I don't know. But to get elected, you had to be more moderate. You had to move towards the center, or appear to move towards the center. And that is a sign of success for conservatives, maybe not the conservative party, but for conservatives in the sense that they've moved the center of gravity about where you actually win elections away from sort of Corbynite nonsense and perfidy and villainy towards, social democracy stuff that I disagree with, but I could live with compared to what a Corbyn type would want. What do you think of that?
I think that's typically interesting and thought-provoking, as you always. I mean, first on the first point, I think you're absolutely right. It is striking that this wider conservative movement, this penumbra around the party, is much stronger in the US than in any other country, even Canada. Americans are much more likely to join lobby groups, pressure groups, campaigns, or indeed anything else. They're a very joiny people compared even to the countries that are culturally closer to them. So the Republican Party in the Bush years had the advantage of nestling within this wider family of talk show hosts and gun clubs and homeschool movements and evangelical churches and all sorts of people who were moving the center of gravity. There isn't anything like that in the UK, and that's a significant difference. But in terms of is this a victory for the right? I mean, certainly the election of Tony Blair was in that sense, right? After that was a moment when the left had to accept the basic propositions of the market in order to get elected. Starmer, it's a more interesting one. The far left here are making hay out of the fact that he got fewer votes than Corbyn did. And they're saying this is, this shows that we've just fluked this one. It was just because of the divided right. There's no enthusiasm. We're going to lose it next time. All this. What's going on in his inner heart? Who knows, right? He's very good at saying what people want to hear at that moment. So he was. Most of his career, he was a man of the firm left. When he was climbing the ladder in Labour, he was always attacking from the left. It's not everyone remarks that he backed Corbyn as Prime Minister twice. I give him a pass on that because I think if that really bothers you, you don't really understand how party politics works. That's a minimum entry requirement. But I give him less of a pass for the fact that as late as March 2020, when he became leader, he was still talking about Corbyn's manifesto is the centerpiece of what we believe. So his conversion has been a very recent one, even by the standards of politicians. But honestly, I think if we're going to look at a really valid parallel here, I think the problem is comparable to what happened in the 70s immediately before Margaret Thatcher took over. The problem that the Conservatives have is that a lot of voters think that if the government isn't spending more money on their particular issue, it's out of meanness. It's out of sheer lack of generosity. It's not because money is limited. Somehow it could all easily be got from the rich or from oil companies or something. And austerity is a sadistic political choice. It's not like a family budget that has to remain within bounds. Now, the only way I think that people are going to be jogged out of that illusion is when they see a Labour government running out of money, which I think is very likely to happen during this term, because we are still, we're 3 years on from the lockdown. The financial crisis is a distant memory, and we are still running a massive deficit with absolutely no plan to bring spending back to where it was in February of 2020 before the lockdowns, right? So this is what I mean by a parallel with the 70s. There was a Tory government that spent too much, followed by a Labour government that then ran out of money. And that created the political scenario where Thatcherism was possible, because people understood then that this was about having to live within our means. Now, some countries in Europe have done that more recently. Because of the Euro crisis, Ireland and Greece are two outstanding examples of countries that just, in order to meet payroll, had to cut spending and did, and have now both done extremely well since. I think something similar is likely to happen. It may even be, and this really would be, the ultimate victory for the wider Conservative movement. Sorry to answer your question in such a long-winded way. It may even be that process of restoring order and sanity to our public finances has to begin under a Labour government, because their hand is forced by international events. So we tend to think in this country, because particularly people of my age who grew up under Thatcher, because we have that experience in the 80s, we tend to think that the reform comes from a successful, radical, free market conservative government that is prepared to take on all comers and do brave things. Actually, if we look at other Anglosphere countries, very often the reform begins on the left. Roger Douglas in New Zealand, Paul Martin in Canada, arguably even Bill Clinton in some ways in the US in terms of welfare reform and so on. So it is not impossible. I wouldn't rule out the possibility. He doesn't want to do this. He'll be dragged there kicking and screaming. But if the bond markets turn on the Labour government, if the penny finally drops that Britain is not bringing its spending down and isn't doing anything to increase growth, it is possible that welfare reform of our useless healthcare system will have to start under these guys.
Yeah, the better example in America than Clinton, although Clinton's a good example, I would argue, is Jimmy Carter. Not a huge fan of Jimmy Carter. I mean, God bless. I've never heard of someone being in hospice this long, but a lot of the deregulatory stuff that we love to tout as Reaganism kind of starts under Jimmy Carter, and of course Reagan then turns it to 11 in all sorts of ways, and all praise and honor on the Gipper. But I think you're right. You often see these things that out of necessity is forced upon the party that doesn't want to do it, and that gives it a legitimacy that then the party that does want to do it can run with.
Right. It opens the door. It opens the door, and that makes all the difference. It allows the other guy then to say, "Look, this isn't scary." Exactly that.
Which is why, in some ways, I feel I'm getting so exhausted hearing about how. And I understand that part of the reason why people are saying it is to butter Joe Biden up to get him off the stage. But I'm constantly hearing how he had the most successful first-term presidency of any American president in modern memory, and all this kind of stuff. And my wife and I are constantly looking around saying, "What are you talking about?" But that said, I think one of the great wastes of his presidency is that he was elected with his mandate to be normal and put America back on a normal path, and instead he got he got buffeted by the hard left and did all sorts of things that I think set him up for the precarious situation that he's in now. Let's move to France for just a second.
That must leave you in an anomalous. You and a handful of people who've been consistently critical of bad politics in both parties. I mean, there was a temptation, and I found myself succumbing to it from time to time, to think there is some really weird thing happening with Trump and Trumpery, and this creepy way in which people require you to change your mind when he does, and become very aggressive if you don't, and it's very un-American, this kind of furor principe and all. But it will pass. This was, and I tended to think, that you look at the gubernatorial candidates being selected, the senatorial and the state, there is still a beating heart of republicanism out there. Actually, if you look not just at the two presidential candidates, the lies and deceit around the state of health of the one and the extraordinary prostration before the other by people who have disgraced themselves. If you look also at their likely vice presidential picks, I think you've got to say that there is a deeper problem here, right? That look at who the Democrats have got, and now I hear talk that it may be J.D. Vance as the Republican. I mean, there comes a point when you have to say this is a structural problem that goes deeper than one anomalous guy, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that my standard line on this is that Donald Trump didn't create all of our problems. He's a symptom of larger problems, but he's made a lot of those problems worse. And I find one of the most remarkable things in this period, the way in which the psychological anatomy of defending Trump is now emerging in defending Biden. And you get a lot of people, I wrote a column about this last week, but my take on Trump has always been his presidency would end badly because character is destiny. Well, his presidency, I think, objectively ended badly, and because character is destiny. You know what else is destiny is old age. And there is this bizarre wish casting that says that somehow Biden is going to get better, or that the debate performance was a one-off, and that therefore, if you question Biden's candidacy, you just want Trump. And I got so much of, if you're questioning Trump's candidacy, you must want Hillary, to the point where I issued a national challenge. Show me the sentence that I wrote that was praising Hillary, and I'll give you $1,000. Because I have never praised Hillary Clinton, in a serious way in my entire 30-year career. But you get the same sort of binary brain that says, since I hate the other side so much, I have to support everything my own side does, full stop. And there's, the similarities are also in the gaslighting, where people expect you to feel like you're the weird one for thinking that Joe Biden is having problems. I mean, Joe Biden, his one issue that he can run on that is like decidedly in his column is abortion. And when he got an abortion question in that debate, he meandered like an Alzheimer's patient in the snow and landed on an answer that said, we don't need to worry about illegal immigrants committing crimes here because there's lots of rapes by American citizens too, including rapes of women by their sisters. That is not the ideal messaging on abortion. And so the idea that somehow you can just sort of wave that away as a one-off, which people did about Trump all the time. Oh, Access Hollywood doesn't mean anything. These aren't the droids you're looking for, all that kind of stuff. There seems to be, and this gets to a point I made in my book, is that when you start following politics as a form of entertainment, you think that you can choose your own adventure and sort of focus group or rewrite the endings to suit the narrative that you want. And I see that going on all over the place in America, but I also see it in the UK. I mean, you were saying earlier before we started recording that there's a bizarrely parallel insecurity among Nigel Farage supporters that if you insult him or question their movement, they take it as a personal affront. And that is something that I'm now seeing with Biden. We've seen it for 10 years with Trump. It's something that's in the culture now about how people invest their identity in these political personalities.
Right. This is not something that has been part of the British experience until now. People, maybe because it's a parliamentary, not a presidential system, it was always not. It was less individual focused, and people were therefore quite ready to have a contingent relationship with their party. And being cynical Brits, we don't really do enthusiasm, as you know. It was quite difficult to get anyone to kind of whoop and cheer in favour of any. In fact, I remember one of my favourite examples of the political and cultural difference between your country and mine is in 2012, when I was at the Republican convention in Tampa, the one that nominated Mitt Romney. And I was with a group of overseas conservatives, not just British, but Australian and South American and so on. And the very nice Republican boy who was showing us to our seats, as we sat down, he said, "Guys, it's possible that the cameras will be on you, so try to look like Americans. No eye rolling." Right? And there is that fundamental thing. Now, so therefore, what you just described, the kind, unless you support my guy, even when he's saying the opposite of what he was saying 5 minutes ago, not only do you support the other guy, but you're a liar and a traitor and an idiot. This has never been part of our culture until now. And I don't want to over egg this, but it's just beginning. So let's explore for a moment the parallel that you began with is Reform UK a Trumpy party. Let me first of all put the positives, which are very genuine. Nigel Farage is a much cleverer guy than Donald Trump and much more self-aware. He's a clever tactician, and he doesn't have the neediness of a toddler. And Reform itself, very much to its credit, has not gone down the line that a lot of insurgent right parties in Europe have done, which is to be kind of left-wing on economics and right-wing on immigration and crime and culture wars. So that the classic sort of Le Pen combination of hands off our benefits and pay our old people more and take the money from immigrants and scrap foreign aid, that's a long way away. The Reform here has tended to attack the government, the old Tory government from the right, on grounds that they didn't cut taxes enough, they didn't deregulate enough, they didn't get on top of the woke civil service and so on. All of which has more than a measure of truth in it. These were completely understandable attack lines. So it's not really, I don't want to. These are not people that you can't deal with. It's not. But when I look at the supporters, not just online, where who knows how many of them are Russian bots, but in real life, this kind of get behind Nigel, show some loyalty. Why were you so, and it's this extraordinary asymmetry of all of you who do not support our guy unconditionally and unequivocally are liars and traitors and should be in the Tower of London and all the rest of it. But we will not tolerate the slightest dissent or implied criticism, even if it takes the form of quoting something that our guy used to say, but he now finds it embarrassing, right? And that is really, I always thought that was the creepiest aspect of Trumpery. I just thought it was weird, un-American, and unmanly. And I really don't like to see it here either.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, everyone wants conservatives in the US to do deep introspection about where we went wrong, when we took a wrong turn. And I've done a lot of that, and I'm happy to have that conversation. But I do think that there are a lot of people on the left who don't realize that there was a lot of that stuff on the left that they just took to be normal. And it's only when the right did it that when there was a real cult of personality around Barack Obama. There was talk about how he was sort of a religious salvific figure, right? And he leaned into that in a lot of ways. There were an enormous number of people who tried to make the argument that if you disagreed with him about how he wanted to reform healthcare, it was because you're racist, which always was sort of weird. And then when the Hillary ran, they tried to do the same thing with sexist. It's like, well, wait a second. This has been my position all along. Are you saying I can't have this position if it's articulated by a black person or by a female? And of course, that's crazy and wildly irrational.
I think they would even. I think that is.
I'm sorry?
What they mean, isn't it? I think that is their position. I really do think that that what you say is defined by power structures, and you're positioned in the imagined hierarchy and so on, and that yes, check your privilege, white man. I mean, I think that is exactly what they think.
Right, and so, but I would make the argument. I've been trying to make this more of a popular term, that there's a thing called critical Trump theory or critical anti-Trumpism, where people do the exact same sort of illogical thought process, where they start from the position that if you're critical of Trump, or if you express a negative opinion about Trump, they then reason backwards about why that's wrong. And so you'll find, when Donald Trump was told by his own attorney general, who he had heaped praise on for most of his tenure, that there was no evidence of sweeping election fraud that would justify any of Trump's claims, Trump's immediate response was, "You must hate Trump," right? Had nothing to do with facts, had nothing to do with arguments or anything like that. And there's a similar phenomenon with critical race theory, which sort of starts with, if you disagree with us about our proposed remedies, you're racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever. And I think that a lot of conservatives saw that on the left and thought, okay, that's a left problem, not an American problem. And now we're seeing a right-wing version of it on the right, and a lot of the left are looking at it and saying, okay, that's a right-wing thing, not an American problem. And it turns out that personality, cults of personality, partisan tribal brain, all of these things, America has a cancel culture problem. It manifests itself one way on the right and one way on the left. But right-wingers want to cancel people all the time, and so do left-wingers. And I think the things I used to reject horseshoe theory, but I've basically embraced it, because to me, I just see illiberalism with right-wing characteristics or illiberalism with left-wing characteristics. But the differences between left-wing and right-wing illiberalism versus it's sort of similar to differences between left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism. Yeah, there are important differences, and they're interesting for cultural and historical reasons. The similarities are more important than the differences. And I just see a lot of the same cultural phenomenon manifesting itself across the ideological spectrum. And I don't.
You see, I wonder. Anyway. I wonder whether. I mean, first, as always, you're spot on. I mean, it implies an incredible degree of stupidity as well, or at least pretended stupidity. That you have people who sort of stay loyal all the way through, James Lankford or whatever, or even Liz Cheney, and then suddenly, oh, you were on Hillary's side all along. It's like, how can anyone say that with a straight face, but they actually convince themselves of it, right? And but you see, I think you and I, because we are broadly conservatives, if we see this phenomenon, I think you and I have both responded in the same way, which is to say, look, there's no shortage of people pointing out the deficiencies on the other side, right? It's the easiest thing to point to these hypocrisies and absurdities when the other guys are doing it. But if we think that this is a general problem in our politics, then something we can do is to try and police our own side's behavior. And as you know, as well as anyone on God's earth, that is about the most unpopular thing that anyone can do in public life, because people hate being reminded of these inconsistencies. You become their bad conscience. And so, this is when I look at the amount of rage that is directed at you, and at a handful of sort of half a dozen other conservative or Republican supporters who have stuck to positions that everyone had during the 2016 primaries, it's so out of proportion to your numbers, to your influence. It's entirely because you're the bad conscience of all these people, which suggests to me that on some very deep level, it's like Jonathan Haidt argues in his first book, even when we deceive ourselves, there's a little bit of us that knows that we're doing it. And I wonder whether, this is why I said pretended stupidity. When people say, James Langford is a communist and a Democrat plant and so on, there is a bit of them, I think, in most cases, that knows that that's nonsense and that they are degrading themselves by taking the line in this way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and thank you for the kind words. But it's funny. Donald Trump last week, I don't know if you saw this, he basically threw the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 under the bus. And my view on this is it would take a heart of stone not to laugh about it, because a more predictable thing in Trump world I cannot think of. Trump has consistently screwed any interest or constituency that has tried to craft an intellectually coherent, ideologically consistent worldview called Trumpism. Because he doesn't have one, and he's very honest about how he doesn't have one. He says, I go with my instincts, but it's like Lucy in the football. You just don't see, you see time and time again, these various interests try to say, no. I know what he's really about, and this is how it all works together and makes consistent sense. And as we're talking about this, we're seeing the vice presidential candidates explain how they're essentially pro-choice now on abortion to fit Trump's demands with the platform. You saw the Federalist Society, which lasted longer in good graces than a lot, is now out of favor with Trump because the Federalist Society justices and judges actually care about the rule of law and won't, go along with the stolen election stuff. And it just consistently, and so the problem with this psychologically, getting back to the conscience point, is that the longer you go trying to defend Donald Trump when he doesn't have a consistent position, the only safe harbor is to fall back on, well, I just trust him. I trust his judgment. That is the only, I trust his instincts. He's, it's dear leader arguments. And it feels a little bit like, it's kind of Napoleonic in its logic, right? It was just like, it's a great man, defer to the great man, and everything will be all right. And stop with your sophistry and bookish impositions on an intellect so profound. And I think that that's where you see a lot of the right go. And I think it's where, when you're reducing politics to a form of entertainment, and therefore to politicians to entertaining personalities, there's a lot of room for allowing a personality to go any way you want, because it's like a character in a movie and you just root for them. And I think that's sort of where a lot of our politics in the Western world is going.
100%. But it's especially odd when it's happening in the republic that was expressly established to stop that. That was completely designed to stop what the founders would have called Caesarism, right? Because they were well aware that people do this. So we're a tribal species, like we like any primate troop has some alpha male. Yeah, they contract out their judgment to the alpha male. They don't have some ideology that says, "Hang on, when you stole the banana from that other troop, were you being consistent?" Because it's not how we're genetically programmed, right? The whole essence of a government of laws, not of men, is to rise above that and to get people to use their gifts of logic and reason. And again, I come back to why is this stopped? And stopped to a degree that requires this cretinous behaviour and utterly human. I mean, this is how degrading is it that you have to keep jumping through hoops almost out for the sadistic pleasure of the guy who can make you do it, right?
Right.
And yet people carry on doing it. And is part of the problem maybe just the complete decline of what used to be called civics, that people have to be taught to understand certain precepts that don't come intuitively, that are not natural, and that isn't happening. And that maybe there's a connection between your kind of Trumpism of the left and what's happening now, which is that if in schools and in high schools, let alone on college campuses, if you are told repeatedly that the most important thing about you is that you're white or female or whatever it is, it's that much harder to encourage a kind of rationalist post-Enlightenment view where you can say, look, we're not bound to support the guy who wears our party colour on tribal grounds. We're citizens and we have a responsibility to look for the greater good. That was a product of a very particular education system, and I worry that we're losing the system that sustains it.
So I did promise listeners that we would at least touch on what happened in France. I'm no expert on France. I don't know that you are, but you will sound like one compared to me, so you can pretty much get away with anything that you want. But it feels to me like, in an effort to stop the Le Pen far right, Macron made what may turn out to be some really poor decisions, or some painful compromises that may look like poor decisions going forward, by compromising with the far left. And where do you see France going? I mean, I woke up this morning I saw that Jews in France was trending on Twitter, and I generally find that whenever you see Jews in any phrasing trending on Twitter, if you click on it, it will be a depressing thing to see. But there are a lot of people, like the head rabbi in France basically says Jews may no longer be welcome there. And he's talking about the problem of the far left, not the far right. How do you see the situation on the ground there?
Never good for a country to lose its Jews, right? It's always a precursor of not only economic catastrophe, but of political authoritarianism. Particularly tragic in France, right? Because most of the Jewish population of France, a lot of the Jewish population of France was rebuilt after the war from people who had been fleeing persecution in North Africa and are now going through it again, and for similar reasons as the first time round. I mean, look, I've been watching some French news today and reading some of the papers. One of the things that is very striking is that all over the airwaves are representatives of the winning party, the Popular Front, demanding that the pension age be reduced again, that the minimum wage be increased, that they be more liberal with immigration, etc., etc., etc. So Macron's bargain, or his initial gamble that has resulted in this, is going to, it looks like, result in the reversal of what reforms he had managed to make to try and restore some competitiveness to the French economy. It's very bad news. I mean, it's very bad news for France. But it's bad news for every neighbouring country, right? I mean, if France pursues even a quarter of the policies that the Popular Front were arguing for there will be a knock-on impact on the whole of Western Europe. It's a big economy to be contracting like that. I do think, coming back to something I said earlier, that we are still seeing the infantilization that followed the lockdowns. Being paid to stay at home for the better part of 2 years changed the relationship between state and citizen. And it made people much more demanding. That why isn't the government paying my mortgage? Why isn't the government paying my energy bills? Why isn't the government doing, I was very struck by this listening to the TV debates in this country in our own election. What are you doing for me? What is give me one good reason. It's like, why haven't you personally driven my kids to school? What are you doing? And in the current mood, the politicians have to sort of defer to this, aggression from any voter. But in the end, you end up with a French type situation where there's just an absolute refusal to recognize any trade-offs at all. That absolute denial that anything has a price tag, and this kind of toddler, like, give me what I voted for or else, and that never ends well.
This is just a factual question I don't know the answer to. I know the French system has a strong presidency. Can Parliament do what its will in the way that, like, I know in the UK, the weird thing about the UK is that once a party wins a majority, there are no checks and balances. I think you guys, have as my people might say, a fakakta system of government, but it's worked out okay for you so far. We don't know whether it's going to be a hung parliament because there are 4 different parties that are part of this Popular Front. But let's just say that the Popular Front has a majority in Parliament. Is there no veto power? I mean, does Macron have to roll over for this stuff?
Jonah, the question you asked that was so deceptively simple that as you asked, it doesn't really have a definitive answer. I mean, it depends which French theorist you ask. The Fifth Republic did not very clearly define exactly the balance between the president and the prime minister. We've had these periods before of what the French call cohabitation, where you have a president from one party and a government from another, and they've never worked out brilliantly. But they've never started even with a consensus on who's in charge of what. Now, everyone can agree in broad terms that the president does foreign policy and defense, and everyone can agree in broad terms that there are elements of domestic policy that are up to the government. But where you draw the line between those two has become, like everything else in this age, a very partisan question. So, and we're dealing in the case of Macron with somebody who's, he has quite control freakish tendencies. So I can't imagine that that's going to be easy, whichever government he's dealing with.
And what about the rest of Europe? Just like curiosity, I mean, like, is the anti-incumbency thing that you think the only sort of theme to the pudding, or is there other trends that you would, identify? I mean,
no, I think I would identify another trend. I mean, the UK and France are quite exceptional in having not joined the general trend to the right, which we saw very clearly at the European elections a month ago in 27 countries. And that was a trend to the right in the broadest sense. The established conservative parties did better, and the insurgent populist parties of the right did better. And I think the explanations for that are actually pretty obvious. First, there's a major war in Europe. And the world is arguably closer to an all-out conflagration than it's been for 60 years. So generally, that tends to help conservatives. That pushes people towards the people who are thought to be more kind of hard-headed on foreign policy. Second, we have the last gasp of post-lockdown inflation, and the cost of living crisis, again, generally favors parties of the right. They're thought to be business people who understand how this works and can get on top of it. And then third, of course, is the immigration. So the more interesting question is, why have the UK and France bucked that trend? I mean, they're not completely alone in doing so, but they're very much in the minority in Europe. In fact, the minority in the West. In Britain, as I said, I think it's to do with the very lengthy incumbency and the lockdown thing and failures of the Conservative Party to deliver on what they promised. There was some this, I don't want to make out that my party was guiltless and was just prisoner of external events. It made some unforced errors. In France, honestly, I think more than anything else, it has to do with the way they have this two-stage voting system and the way the centre and the left were still able to play the old song of stop the extremists. And, having said that Farage is, compared to all these parties, a very moderate fellow, he's very anti-Le Pen and he's a sort of free marketeer. A lot of the Rassemblement National people really still have a certain sort of Vichyist tinge to their politics, right? There is this is not all of them, but I mean, I remember when I was in the European Parliament talking to one of their, I shared a Parliament car to the airport with a very well-mannered, very well-educated academic. I can't really say much more than that without identifying him. And he spent the car journey explaining to me that it was just the most weird and disgusting journey, explaining to me that the Holocaust couldn't have happened in the way that was claimed because he'd calculated the volume of the ovens. And I mean, it was just the most unreal conversation. So, you can still understand why, when the chips are down, a lot of people in that situation will break left.
So this is a fraught question, but it one of the things I think I can say this as an objective analysis is that, look, immigration is a very potent issue in the United States, and legitimately so, particularly illegal immigration. But one of the things, all right, the United States has benefited from two things that a lot of European countries don't benefit from. One is we're actually really good at assimilation, because in part because of just the nature of our culture and how we started, and a nation of immigrants and that whole thing. And two, the kind of immigrants we get are, first of all, they're making a real bet on becoming Americans. So that's part of why the assimilation is better. But also, Hispanics, Latin Americans, they come from essentially Catholic or increasingly Protestant countries. They come from Christian nations. And they have a certain amount of, and we have a culture that knows how to absorb that, and that the North African and Middle Eastern immigrants, Islamic, Muslim immigrants, struggle more with assimilation. And I would argue for this, it's a two-pronged thing. Just like we have two benefits in the United States, you have two things going against you in a lot of Europe, maybe a little less in the UK, is that, the French are really bad at assimilation. And I would think the immigrants are really bad at wanting to be assimilated. And so you have a sort of an oil and water problem on both ends of the thing. How much of that is freely discussed in both European politics and also UK politics? Because it seems to me like you watch a lot of these anti-Israel protests or pro-Hamas protests, it is very difficult not to conclude that the immigration subtext is powerful to it all.
I mean, obviously, the fact that you have a very large number of people who feel connected to Palestine is going to affect foreign policy. Let's be fair-minded about it. The same is true in reverse in the US, right? If there was no Jewish population in the US, so that's kind of, that's not in itself a sinister thing. But what you were saying about the nature of assimilation, I think, is absolutely spot on. So first of all, I would say this. I was born and brought up in Lima, Peru, so I think Latinos are an incredibly good, hard-working, enterprising, decent, law-abiding people. And the US is very lucky in the source of a lot of its immigrants, and actually incredibly ungrateful for that fact, I think, in my conversations. I'm often struck by how much more appreciative the immigrants are to be there, how patriotic they are, compared to the attitude of some of the longer established population. I mean, incredibly, since I'm always the only person who doesn't have an accent when I'm in Texas or California or New Mexico, I sometimes find that recent Hispanic arrivals don't understand me. So I will switch to the South American Spanish, which was my native language, but they'll switch back to English as quickly as they can. They're polite, but they've made a decision not just about where they want to live, but about who they want to be and who they want their kids to be. And that's an extraordinary thing. Now, why is the US good at that? Yes, nation of immigrants, all that, but that, you can't just rely on the history to do it for you. The expressions of American patriotism, as I properly pronounce it, the expressions of American patriotism that Euro panty waists find most kind of cringy, the bunting and the fireworks and the 4th of July and the flags, in every yard, that makes it very easy for a newcomer to buy into something. There's a very strong brand there that you can belong to. Now, in Europe, that is emphatically not the case. In Europe, the predominant ideology is that the nation state is finished and is in any case discreditable because it causes wars. And yeah, we might have to put up with it because we've got some sort of rubes who are still attached to it, but no one should be proud of it. And what does that give the newcomer to want to assimilate into, right? It's very striking that the hotbed of where a lot of the bombers and terrorists in France came from is a district in Brussels called Molenbeek, which is very close to where I used to work in the European Parliament. I used to drive through it, and of course, most people in Molenbeek are perfectly law-abiding, but one is very struck. Belgium, if you like, takes the European lack of nationality furthest. Because as well as the general Euro-correct thing of nation states are transient and arbitrary and passé, you've got this extra thing that there isn't a Belgian language, there isn't a Belgian culture, there isn't really much Belgian history. Belgium exists as a monarchy and a football team and not much else. So in Belgium, you have two separate populations who speak two languages, read two sets of newspapers, watch two sets of TV stations, even shop at different supermarkets. There's like a Flemish and a Walloon brand. Where does that leave the child of Moroccan or Turkish immigrants, right? He's not Flemish, he's not Walloon. What is there for him to be part of, right? All of his interactions with the Belgian state have told him to despise it. He's constantly told that the nation state is, the patriotism is the kind of, is a sign of being a credulous imbecile. It would be extraordinary if some kids growing up in that environment were not casting around for a more assertive identity. And whatever else we say about these jihadi nutters, they do not lack self-confidence, right? So they are providing that strong sense of identity and community because the nation states don't. And this, I think, is where the US has got something right that Europe has got badly wrong, and that Europe is being very, very slow to learn from. Maybe incapable, because so many people have salaries that now depend on multi-culti, translations of everything into other languages and all the rest of it. So I just end with this plea to American listeners of the Remnant, right? I don't think there has ever been a moment in US history when immigration has been popular. And what is very striking is that the argument is always the same. It's been the same since the beginning of the 19th century, which immigration has all been great until now, but this time it's different, right? And there's always some new reason why this time it's different. Yeah, but until now they were all Christian. Until now they all spoke English. Until now they were all Protestant. Until now they were all white. Actually, it has worked extremely well. The US has continued to outperform other countries, to become richer, to become freer, to become stronger, and to inculcate this sense of patriotism that very few other countries are able to do with newcomers. And that has been an amazing endeavor that may be more obvious to the outside observer than to someone in the US itself. How I long to hear a contemporary American politician channel the optimism of the Gipper when he said that time, every immigrant makes America more American.
So I agree with a lot of that aspirationally, philosophically and all that. I also think having, my standard answer to when people ask me what's my preferred immigration policy, my standard answer is to have one. And if it's 1 million immigrants a year, great, then it's 1 million. If it's 500,000, great, it's 500,000. If it's a temporary pause for a little while, it's not my preference, but fine. Anything that instores faith and confidence in the legitimacy of our immigration policy would be a step forward in the right direction compared to the agreed upon lawlessness of the current situation, which invites demagogues to take advantage of it and do and say terrible things. I would argue, and I don't think you're going to disagree with me on this, that there's another reason why we're better at assimilating immigrants than European countries as a rule, and that's free market capitalism. Insofar as when you have job opportunities and the ability to grow and flourish and demonstrate your own merit in a competitive market system, you don't have necessarily time to sit around and stew on your resentments about how the system isn't accommodating you. You got work to do. And when you have the sort of sclerotic welfare state systems that a lot of Europe, and one could argue outside of London, the UK has, which have knock-on effects like the inability to buy a house, the inability to afford a mortgage, large swaths of young men who are underemployed or unemployed will always embrace bad ideas, regardless of religion or nationality or ethnicity. That is an ancient story. And having a dynamic economy makes assimilation possible to a certain extent because it allows people to judge people by the content of their character and their performance. And it's a small d democratic thing. Non-dynamic economies fill up with resentful young people who then try to find reasons to rationalize their resentment and their failures with poisonous ideas. And I think that's, there a lot of the poison in the politics in Europe, I think, would be solved by 4% growth. Not completely, but it would help a long way. It would go a long way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, the relationship between welfarism and discontent or even political violence is underexplored, right? I've always thought if you wanted to create the perfect terrorist habitat, you'd create something very similar to the Gaza Strip, where nobody works and everyone is dependent on handouts, and made resentful of the way in which the handouts happen. There's no international trade because the borders are closed, and no one's going to set up a drive-through halal takeaway because they haven't got the opportunity. So they're exactly as you say, they're sitting around getting resentful. I don't think I've yet bored Remnant listeners with who is currently my favorite politician in the world, which is the leader of the Canadian Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, who is a total superstar on every level in terms of his ability, his ideas, his story. But one of the things that I think is interesting and is little appreciated about him is the extent to which he pitches very successfully for support from new Canadians, right, from immigrant Canadians, by being the guy who is going to, as he puts it, get rid of the gatekeepers. In other words, break the cartels. So why is it that you, newly arrived Taiwanese surgeon, are an Uber driver? Because we are being so slow to recognize your qualifications. Why is it that you, Korean academic, are flipping burgers because of some tenure scheme that doesn't allow you to compete? And it's an incredibly powerful message, and inshallah is going to see him win a well-deserved majority when their election comes.
We don't normally end this podcast with hosannas to Canada, but this is the first time for everything. I like Canada, but my wife's Alaskan, and there's a tension there. Whenever we say food tastes vaguely wrong, we just say it tastes vaguely Canadian. And I will recall, just as a cleanup operation, the last time you were on here, you were praising the civility and decency of Canadians, and we had a lot of listeners say, that's not my experience in Canada. We have a lot of Canadian listeners. I do like Canada, who say that there is rudeness and pushback in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is some, but I am going to make a defense of Canada in this sense. Such is the reach of U.S. media, and so powerful is U.S. culture, that a lot of Canadians, in my experience, have started to see themselves through essentially American eyes, and have started to see their country as a kind of gnomic, kind of touchy-feely, sort of European version of the US. I will just, because I don't want to end by insulting our allies in the big Dominion. I would just finish by recalling that in private, obviously he didn't say this in public, Eisenhower always used to remark that Canadians, man for man, were the best troops under his command. And this Trudeau version of Canada, this touchy-feely national healthcare woke thing, would have been utterly bewildering to any Canadian until about 1970. And so I think they may be about to recover their own tradition as really quite a tough-minded people.
I think that's fair. There's an analog to Scotland. I mean, the Scots today are nothing like the Scots of Adam Smith and all that. And one, just so I can correct you while you're here, I believe the oldest political part.
The most enterprising socialism, including my mother.
I just one thing to correct you on. I believe the oldest political party in the world is the American Democratic Party, not the Tories. I looked it up while you were talking earlier.
Yeah, well, okay, no, I'm sorry. I'm gonna outgeek you on this, because that only works if you count the Democratic Republican predecessor as the same party. Well, if you're going to do that, then you have to count the Tory party as the predecessor of the Conservative Party, in which case we go back to 1680. Beat that.
Fair enough. I knew you would have a response, and I didn't want to correct you after you left, and then you say turn the recorder back on. You've done me wrong. Daniel Hannan, thank you so much for doing this. You were a listener favorite and a host favorite, and I hope you'll be back.
Thank you very much, Jonah. Always a pleasure.